Chapter 9, Part 2 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. To this explosive condition of things, the news of Burgoyne's surrender acted as a spark. The experience of former wars had taught France the worth of the Americans as enemies, and she was expecting to find in them valuable helpers in her schemes of revenge. Now it seemed that even alone they might be able to take care of themselves and reject any alliance. The tidings reached Europe on the 2nd of December, 1777. On the 16th, the French foreign minister informed the commissioners of Congress that the king was ready to recognize the independence of the United States and to make with them a commercial treaty and contingent defensive alliance. The speed with which the business was done shows that France had made up her mind, and the treaty, so momentous in its necessary consequences, was signed on the 6th of February, 1778. It is not necessary to give the detailed terms of the treaty, but it is important to observe, first, that the express renunciation of Canada and Nova Scotia by France foreshadowed that political theory which is now known as the Monroe Doctrine, the claims of which can scarcely be made good without an adequate sea force; and next, that the alliance with France, and subsequently with Spain, brought to the Americans that which they above all needed, a sea power to counterbalance that of England. Will it be too much for American pride to admit that, had France refused to contest the control of the sea with England, the latter would have been able to reduce the Atlantic seaboard? Let us not kick down the ladder by which we mounted, nor refuse to acknowledge what our fathers felt in their hour of trial. Before going on with the story of this maritime war, the military situation as it existed in the different parts of the world should be stated. The three features which cause it to differ markedly from that at the opening of the 7 Years' War in 1756 are: 1. The hostile relation of America to England; 2. The early appearance of Spain as the ally of France; and 3. The neutrality of the other continental states, which left France without preoccupation on the land side. On the North American continent, the Americans had held Boston for 2 years. Narragansett Bay and Rhode Island were occupied by the English, who also held New York and Philadelphia. Chesapeake Bay and its entrance, being without strong posts, were in the power of any fleet that appeared against them. In the South, since the unsuccessful attack upon Charlestown in 1776, no movement of importance had been made by the English. Up to the declaration of war by France, the chief events of the war had been north of the Chesapeake, of Baltimore. In Canada, on the other hand, the Americans had failed, and it remained to the end a firm base to the English power. In Europe, the most significant element to be noted is the state of preparedness of the French navy, and to some extent of the Spanish, as compared with previous wars. England stood wholly on the defensive and without allies, while the Bourbon kings aimed at the conquest of Gibraltar and Port Mahon and the invasion of England. The first two, however, were the dear objects of Spain, the last of France, and this divergence of aims was fatal to the success of this maritime coalition. In the introductory chapter, allusion was made to the strategic question raised by these two policies. In the West Indies, the grip of the two combatants on the land was in fact about equal, though it should not have been so. Both France and England were strongly posted in the Windward Islands, the one at Martinique, the other at Barbadoes. It must be noted that the position of the latter, to windward of all others of the group, was a decided strategic advantage in the days of sail. As it happened, the fighting was pretty nearly confined to the neighborhood of the Lesser Antilles. Here, at the opening of the struggle, the English island of Dominica lay between the French Martinique and Guadeloupe. It was therefore coveted and seized. Next, south of Martinique, lay St. Lucia, a French colony. Its strong harbor on the lee side, known as Gros Îlot Bay, was a capital place from which to watch the proceedings of the French navy in Fort Royal, Martinique. The English captured the island, and from that safe anchorage Rodney watched and pursued the French fleet before his famous action in 1782. The islands to the southward were of inferior military consequence. In the greater islands, Spain should have outweighed England, holding as she did Cuba, Puerto Rico, and, with France, Haiti, as against Jamaica alone. Spain, however, counted here for nothing but a dead weight, and England had elsewhere too much on her hands to attack her. The only point in America where the Spanish arms made themselves felt was in the great region east of the Mississippi, then known as Florida, which, though at that time an English possession, did not join the revolt of the colonies. In the East Indies, it will be remembered that France had received back her stations at the peace of 1763, but the political predominance of the English in Bengal was not offset by similar control of the French in any part of the peninsula. During the ensuing years, the English had extended and strengthened their power, favored in so doing by the character of their chief representatives, Clive and Warren Hastings. Powerful native enemies had, however, risen against them in the south of the peninsula, both on the east and west, affording an excellent opportunity for France to regain her influence when the war broke out. But her government and people remained blind to the possibilities of that vast region. Not so England. The very day the news of the outbreak of war reached Calcutta, July 7, 1778, Hastings sent orders to the governor of Madras to attack Pondicherry and set the example by seizing Chandernagore. The naval force of each nation was insignificant, but the French commodore, after a brief action, forsook Pondicherry, which surrendered after a siege by land and sea of 70 days. The following March, 1779, Mahé, the last French settlement, fell, and the French flag again disappeared, while at the same time there arrived a strong English squadron of 6 ships of the line under Admiral Hughes. The absence of any similar French force gave the entire control of the sea to the English until the arrival of Suffren, nearly 3 years later. In the meanwhile, Holland had been drawn into the war, and her stations, Negapatam, on the Coromandel coast, and the very important harbor of Trincomalee in Ceylon were both captured, the latter in January 1782 by the joint forces of the army and navy. The successful accomplishment of these two enterprises completed the military situation in Hindustan at the time when the arrival of Suffren, just 1 month later, turned the nominal war into a desperate and bloody contest. Suffren found himself with a decidedly stronger squadron, but without a port, either French or allied, on which to base his operations against the English. Of these 4 chief theatres of the war, 2, North America and the West Indies, as might be expected from their nearness, blend and directly affect each other. This is not so obviously the case with the struggles in Europe and India. The narrative therefore naturally falls into 3 principal divisions, which may to some extent be treated separately. After such separate consideration, their mutual influence will be pointed out, together with any useful lessons to be gathered from the goodness or badness, the success or failure of the grand combinations, and from the part played by sea power. On the 13th of March, 1778, the French ambassador at London notified the English government that France had acknowledged the independence of the United States, and made with them a treaty of commerce and defensive alliance. England at once recalled her ambassador; but though war was imminent and England at disadvantage, the Spanish king offered mediation, and France wrongly delayed to strike. In June, Admiral Keppel sailed from Portsmouth with 20 ships on a cruise, falling in with 2 French frigates, his guns to bring them to open the war. Finding from their papers that 32 French ships lay in Brest, he at once returned for reinforcements. Sailing again with 30 ships, he fell in with the French fleet under D'Orvilliers to the westward of Ushant, and to windward with a westerly wind. On the 27th of July was fought the first fleet action of the war, generally known as the Battle of Ushant. This battle, in which 30 ships of the line fought on either side, was wholly indecisive in its results. No ship was taken or sunk. Both fleets, after separating, returned to their respective ports. The action nevertheless obtained great celebrity in England from the public indignation at its lack of result, and from the storm of naval and political controversy which followed. The admiral and the officer third in command belonged to different political parties. They made charges one against the other, and in the following courts martial all England divided, chiefly on party lines. Public and naval sentiment generally favored the commander in chief, Keppel. Tactically, the battle presents some interesting features, and involves one issue which is still living to day. Keppel was to leeward and wished to force an action. In order to do this, he signaled a general chase to windward, so that his fastest ships might overtake the slower ones of the enemy. Granting equal original fleet speed, this was quite correct. D'Orvilliers to windward had no intention of fighting except on his own terms. As will generally be the case, the fleet acting on the offensive obtained its wish. At daybreak of the 27th, both fleets were on the port tack, heading west-northwest, with a steady breeze at southwest. The English rear had fallen to leeward, and Keppel consequently made signal to 6 of his ships to chase to windward, so as to place them in a better position to support the main body if it could get into action. D'Orvilliers observed this movement, and construed it to show an intention to attack his rear with a superior force. The 2 fleets being then from 6 to 8 miles apart, he wore his fleet in succession, by which he lost ground to leeward, but approached the enemy and was able to see them better. At the completion of this evolution, the wind hauled to the southward, favoring the English; so Keppel, instead of going about, stood on for half an hour more, and then tacked together in wake of the French. This confirmed D'Orvilliers' suspicions, and as the wind, which certainly favored the English that morning, now hauled back again to the westward, permitting them to lay up for the French rear, he wore his fleet together, thus bringing the rest to aid the rear, now become the van, and preventing Keppel from concentrating on or penetrating it. The 2 fleets thus passed on opposite tacks, exchanging ineffective broadsides, the French running free to windward and having the power to attack, but not using it. D'Orvilliers then made the signal for his van, formerly the rear, to wear to leeward of the English rear, which was to leeward of its own main body, intending himself to remain to windward, and so attack it on both sides. But the commander of that division, a prince of the blood royal, did not obey, and the possible advantage was lost. On the English side the same manoeuvre was attempted. The admiral of the van and some of his ships tacked, as soon as out of fire, and stood after the French rear; but for the most part the damage to rigging prevented tacking, and wearing was impossible on account of the ships coming up behind. The French now stood to leeward and formed line again, but the English were not in condition to attack. This was the end of the battle. It has been said that there are some interesting points about this resultless engagement. One is that Keppel's conduct was approved throughout, on oath before the court martial, by one of the most distinguished admirals England has brought forth, Sir John Jervis, who commanded a ship in the fleet. It does not, indeed, appear what he could have done more, but his lack of tactical understanding is shown by a curious remark in his defence. "If the French admiral really meant to come to action," says he, "I apprehend he would never have put his fleet on the contrary tack to that on which the British fleet was approaching." This remark can only proceed from ignorance or thoughtlessness of the danger to which the rear of the French fleet would have been exposed, and is the more curious, as he himself had said the English were lying up for it. Keppel's idea seems to have been that the French should have waited for him to come up abreast, and then go at it, ship for ship, in what was to him the good old style. D'Orvilliers was too highly trained to be capable of such action. The failure of the Duc de Chartres, commanding the French van during the firing, to wear in obedience to orders, whether due to misunderstanding or misconduct, raises the question, which is still debated, as to the proper position for a naval commander in chief in action. Had D'Orvilliers been in the van, he could have ensured the evolution he wished. From the centre the admiral has the extremities of his fleet equally visible, or invisible, as it may be. At the head he enforces his orders by his example. The French, toward the end of this war, solved the question by taking him out of the line altogether and putting him on board a frigate, for the avowed reasons that he could thus better see the movements of his fleet and of the enemy without being blinded by smoke or distracted by the occurrences on board his own ship, and that his signals could be better seen. This position, resembling somewhat that of a general on shore, being remote from personal risk, was also assumed by Lord Howe in 1778; but both that officer and the French abandoned the practice later. Nelson at Trafalgar, the end of his career, led his column, but it may be doubted whether he had any other motive than his ardor for battle. The two other great attacks in which he commanded in chief were directed against ships at anchor, and in neither did he take the head of the column, for the good reason that, his knowledge of the ground being imperfect, the leading ship was in most danger of grounding. The common practice in the days of broadside sailing ships, except when a general chase was ordered, was for the admiral to be in the line, and in the centre of it. The departure from this custom on the part of both Nelson and Collingwood, each of whom led his own columns at Trafalgar, may have had some reason, and an ordinary man rather shrinks from criticizing the action of officers of their eminence. The danger to which were exposed the two senior officers of the fleet, upon whom so much depended, is obvious, and had any serious injury befallen their persons or the head of their columns, the lack of their influence would have been seriously felt. As it was, they were speedily obliterated as admirals in the smoke of the battle, leaving to those who came after them no guidance or control except the brilliancy of their courage and example. A French admiral has pointed out that the practical effect of the mode of attack at Trafalgar, two columns bearing down upon a line at right angles to them, was to sacrifice the head of the columns in making two breaches in the enemy's line. So far, very well. The sacrifice was well worth while. And into these breaches came up the rear ships of each column, nearly fresh, forming in fact a reserve which fell upon the shattered ships of the enemy on either side of the breaks. Now, this idea of a reserve prompts a thought as to the commander-in-chief. The size of his ship was such as precluded its being out of the order. But would it not have been well had the admiral of each column been with this reserve, keeping in his hands the power of directing it according to the chances of the action, making him a reality as well as a name for some time longer, and to a very useful purpose? The difficulty of arranging any system of signals or light dispatch boats which could take the place of the aids or messengers of a general, coupled with the fact that ships cannot stand still, as divisions of men do, waiting orders, but that they must have steerage way, precludes the idea of putting an admiral of a fleet under way in a light vessel. By so doing he becomes simply a spectator, whereas by being in the most powerful ship of the fleet he retains the utmost weight possible after action is once engaged; and if this ship be in the reserve, the admiral keeps to the latest possible moment the power of commander-in-chief in his own hands. Half a loaf is better than no bread. If the admiral cannot, from the conditions of sea warfare, occupy the calmly watchful position of his brother on shore, let there be secured for him as much as may be. The practice of Farragut after New Orleans and Vicksburg, that is to say, in the latter part of his career, when it may be believed experience had determined his views, was to lead in person. It is known that he very reluctantly, at the solicitation of various officers, yielded his convictions in this matter at Mobile, so far as to take the second place, and afterward freely expressed his regrets for having done so. It may, however, be argued that the character of all the actions in which Farragut commanded had a peculiarity differentiating them from battles in the strict sense of the word. At New Orleans, at Vicksburg, at Port Hudson, and at Mobile, the task was not to engage, but to pass fortifications which the fleet confessedly could not stand up to; and the passage was to be made under conditions mainly of pilotage, upon ground as to which, unlike Nelson, he had good knowledge. There was thus imposed upon the commander-in-chief the duty of leadership in the literal as well as the military sense of the term. So leading, he not only pointed out to the fleet the safe road, but drawing continually ahead of the smoke, was better able to see and judge the path ahead, and to assume the responsibility of a course which he may have prescribed and intended throughout, but from which a subordinate might shrink. It has not perhaps been commonly noted that at Mobile the leaders, not only of one but of both columns, at the critical point of the road, hesitated and doubted as to the admiral's purpose; not that they had not received it clearly, but because circumstances seemed to them to be different from what he had supposed. Not only Alden in the Brooklyn, but Craven also in the Tecumseh, departed from the admiral's orders and left the course dictated to them, with disastrous results. There is no necessity to condemn either captain, but the irresistible inference is that Farragut was unqualifiedly right in his opinion that the man who alone has the highest responsibility should, under the conditions of his battles, be in the front. And here it must be remarked that at such critical moments of doubt any but the highest order of mind tends to throw off the responsibility of decision upon the superior, though from the instancy of the case hesitation or delay may be fatal. A man who has the commissioned chief would act intelligently, as the mere subordinate will balk. Nelson's action at St. Vincent will rarely be emulated, a truth which is strongly shown by the fact that Collingwood was immediately in his rear that day, and did not imitate his action till signaled by the commander-in-chief. Yet after receiving the authority of the signal, he particularly distinguished himself by his judgment and daring. It will be recalled also, in connection with this question of pilot ground battles, that a central position nearly lost the flagship at New Orleans, owing to the darkness and to the smoke from the preceding ships. The United States fleet came near finding itself without its leader after the passage of the forts. Now, as the mention of a reserve prompted one set of considerations, so the name of pilotage suggests certain ideas broader than itself, which modify what has been said of keeping the admiral with the reserve. The ease and quickness with which a steam fleet can change its formation make it very probable that a fleet bearing down to attack may find itself, almost at the very moment of collision, threatened with some unlooked-for combination. Then where would be the happiest position for an admiral? Doubtless in that part of his own order where he could most readily pilot his ships into the new disposition or direction by which he would meet the changed conditions, that is, in the position of leading. It would seem that there are always two moments of greatest importance in a sea fight, one which determines the method of the main attack, the other the bringing up and directing the effort of the reserve. If the first is more important, the second perhaps requires the higher order of ability, for the former may and should proceed on a before determined plan, while the latter may, and often must, be shaped to meet unforeseen exigencies. The conditions of sea battles of the future contain one element that land battles cannot have, the extreme rapidity with which encounters and changes of order can take place. However troops may be moved by steam to the field of battle, they will there fight on foot or on horseback, and with a gradual development of their plan, which will allow the commander in chief time to make his wishes known, as a rule, of course, in case of a change in the enemy's attack. On the other hand, a fleet, comparatively small in numbers, and with its component units clearly defined, may be meditating an important change of which no sign can appear until it begins, and which will occupy but a few minutes. So far as these remarks are sound, they show the need of a second in command thoroughly conversant with not only the plans, but with the leading principles of action of his chief; a need plain enough from the fact that the two extremities of the order of battle may be necessarily remote, and that you want the spirit of the leader at both extremities. As he cannot be there in person, the best thing is to have an efficient second at one end. As regards Nelson's position at Trafalgar, mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, it is to be noted that the Victory did nothing that another ship could not have done as well, and that the lightness of the wind forbade the expectation of any sudden change in the enemy's order. The enormous risk run by the person of the admiral, on whose ship was concentrated the fire of the enemy's line, and which led several captains to implore a change, was condemned long before by Nelson himself in one of his letters after the battle of the Nile. "I think if it had pleased God I had not been wounded, not a boat would have escaped to have told the tale. But do not believe that any individual in the fleet is to blame. I only mean to say that if my experience could in person have directed those individuals, there was every appearance that Almighty God would have continued to bless my endeavors," etc. Yet, notwithstanding such an expression of opinion based upon experience, he took the most exposed position at Trafalgar, and upon the loss of the leader there followed a curious exemplification of its effects. Collingwood at once, rightly or wrongly, avoidably or unavoidably, reversed Nelson's plans, urged with his last breath. "Anchor, Hardy, do you anchor," said the dying chief. "Anchor," said Collingwood. "It is the last thing I should have thought of." CHAPTER IX.